A cozy coffee shop, an unexpected encounter, and a passion that seemed perfect. But Emily hid a secret capable of changing everything. When the truth comes to light, Ryan finds himself facing the most difficult decision of his life. Can love survive a lie? The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air of the small establishment in downtown Chicago. It was just another ordinary day for the regulars at Cozy Corner Cafe, an unpretentious spot known for its simplicity and warm service. For Ryan Montgomery, one of the country's most influential businessmen, it was supposed to be just another break between important meetings. At least that's what he thought. The bell above the door chimed softly as he entered, seeking refuge from the urban chaos that dominated the streets. His eyes, accustomed to analyzing spreadsheets and multi-million-dollar contracts, scanned the room in search of a discreet table. That's when he saw her for the first time. Emily moved between the tables with a natural grace that caught attention. Her brown hair was tied in a messy bun, and the cafe's apron couldn't hide her innate elegance. There was something different about her, something Ryan couldn't explain. Perhaps it was the genuine smile she offered each customer, or the way her honey-colored eyes seemed to convey a peace he hadn't experienced in a long time. "Welcome to Cozy Corner," she said, approaching with a notepad. "Can I help you with your order?" Ryan found himself momentarily speechless, something rare for someone used to commanding meetings and closing multi-million-dollar deals. "Her double espresso, please," he managed to say, trying to maintain his composure. "Is that all? We have some cheese pastries fresh out of the oven that are the house specialty," Emily suggested, with that same smile that seemed to light up the room. "In that case, I can't refuse," he replied, surprising himself with his own informality. While waiting for his order, Ryan found himself observing her work. There was a simplicity in her gestures that contrasted drastically with the world he was accustomed to. In recent weeks, he had attended dinners at starred restaurants and social events full of influential people, but none of those moments had given him the sense of peace he felt now in this unpretentious cafe. Emily returned with his order, placing the coffee cup and a small basket of cheese pastries on the table. "I hope you enjoy," she said, and for a moment their eyes met. "Have you worked here long?" Ryan asked, surprising himself with his own interest. "A few months," she replied, nervously adjusting her apron. "It's a special place. The people here are like family." There was something in the way she spoke, a mixture of affection and melancholy, that piqued Ryan's curiosity even more. In his business world, he was used to dealing with people who always wanted something in return, who measured every word and every gesture in search of advantages. Emily seemed different. Her sincerity was almost palpable. What was meant to be a quick coffee stop turned into almost an hour of conversation. Ryan discovered that Emily loved classic literature, had a special fondness for stray cats, and dreamed of one day opening her own coffee shop. Every word from her fascinated him more, not for what she said, but for the way she expressed herself with an authenticity he no longer believed existed. In the days that followed, Ryan began to make Cozy Corner Cafe his mandatory stop. He reorganized his schedule, cancelled some appointments, and for the first time in years, allowed himself to prioritize something besides work. His visits to the cafe became the most anticipated moment of his days. Emily, in turn, began to anxiously await his arrival. There was something different about Ryan, something that went beyond his elegant appearance and professional success. Behind the impeccable suit and luxury watch, she sensed a loneliness she recognized well, an emptiness that no bank account could fill. On a particularly quiet afternoon, Ryan arrived earlier than usual. The cafe was almost empty, and Emily had more time to chat. Sitting at his usual table, he watched her as she cleaned the counter, lost in thought. "You never told me about your family," he commented casually, noticing how she hesitated for a moment before answering. "There's not much to tell," she said, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Sometimes you need to build your own family along the way." That seemingly simple answer carried a weight that Ryan couldn't ignore. There were mysteries in Emily, untold stories that hid behind her sweet smile, but curiously this only attracted him more. After weeks of daily visits, Ryan finally gathered the courage to ask her to dinner. To his surprise, Emily hesitated. "I don't know if it would be appropriate," she said, biting her lower lip. "You're an important customer of the cafe, and I'm just a man inviting a special woman to dinner," he gently interrupted. "Nothing more than that." The dinner took place at a discreet restaurant, away from the spotlight that normally followed Ryan. Emily arrived wearing a simple but elegant dress, her hair loose framing her face in a way that left him breathless. The conversation flowed naturally, as it always did between them. It was during dessert that Ryan realized he was hopelessly in love. It wasn't just Emily's beauty that enchanted him, but her way of seeing the world, her kindness to those around her, her ability to find joy in the simplest things. "You're different from anyone I've ever met," he confessed, as they walked through the city after dinner. Emily stopped walking, turning to face him. There was an intensity in her gaze that Ryan had never seen before. "You have no idea how much," she murmured, almost to herself. That night marked the beginning of a relationship that defied all conventions of the world to which Ryan belonged. His friends didn't understand how one of the country's most eligible businessmen had fallen in love with a simple waitress. His partners warned him about the risks of such an unequal relationship, but Ryan didn't care. For him, every moment with Emily was a discovery. She introduced him to a world he had forgotten existed: Sunday afternoons in public parks, ice creams eaten on park benches, conversations that extended into the early hours about dreams and fears. The marriage proposal happened spontaneously, during an impromptu picnic in Central Park. Emily had prepared a basket with breads, cheeses, and fruits, and they were watching the sunset reflected in the lake. "Marry me," Ryan said simply, without a ring or elaborate planning. That's how it worked with them, in simplicity, in the truth of feelings. Emily froze for a moment, her eyes filling with tears. For an instant, something like fear crossed her gaze, but it was quickly replaced by a radiant smile. "Yes," she answered, her voice trembling slightly. "Yes, I'll marry you." What neither of them knew at that moment was that that yes would be just the beginning of a much more complex story than anyone could imagine. As they embraced by the lake, their lives intertwined in a way that would make it impossible to distinguish where love ended and where secrets began. The wedding preparations revealed the first cracks in the apparent perfection of the relationship. While Ryan wanted a grand celebration worthy of the pages of society magazines, Emily insisted on something more intimate and discreet. The discussion about the guest list brought up issues that until then had been skillfully avoided. "But you must have some childhood friends, people from your hometown you'd like to invite," Ryan insisted, sitting in his office in the penthouse of Montgomery Enterprises, reviewing the guest list for the 10th time. Emily nervously adjusted the sleeve of her blouse, a gesture that Ryan was beginning to recognize as a sign of discomfort. "I prefer to keep things simple, love. The people at the cafe are my family now. I don't need anyone else." Ryan put down his pen on the mahogany desk and observed his fiancée more closely. There was something in the way she averted her gaze, when the subject was her past, that was beginning to arouse his curiosity. As a businessman, he was accustomed to trusting his instincts, and something told him there was more to this story than Emily was letting on. "Not even your parents?" he asked softly, noticing how her shoulders instantly tensed. "We've talked about this," she replied, getting up to approach the panoramic window that offered a spectacular view of Chicago. Some stories are better left in the past. The afternoon sun cast elongated shadows on Emily's face, and for a moment Ryan saw something different in her expression, a mixture of sadness and fear. But before he could question further, she turned with her characteristic smile, the one that had won him over on the first day at the cafe. "What matters is our future together," she said, approaching to kiss him softly. "Why don't we do something in the garden of your house in Lake Forest? Just the people who really matter." Ryan gave in, as he always did when Emily smiled that way. Deep down, he knew she was right. What mattered was being together, not the size of the celebration. Still, a small voice in his mind questioned why his fiancée seemed so determined to keep her past in the shadows. The wedding took place on a golden spring afternoon. The garden of the Montgomery mansion had been transformed into a fairy tale setting, with white and pale pink flowers decorating every surface. Emily was stunning in her simple but elegant dress, her eyes shining with happiness as she walked to the improvised altar under a pergola covered with jasmine. During the ceremony, Ryan couldn't take his eyes off her. Emily radiated such genuine happiness that it made his heart ache. How could he doubt someone who looked at him with so much love? The reception was intimate, as Emily had wished. Only 50 guests, mainly Ryan's close friends and the staff from Cozy Corner Cafe, who had become a true family for her. Mrs. Chen, the cafe owner, cried with emotion as she hugged her former employee. "You deserve all the happiness in the world, my dear," said the lady, holding Emily's hands in hers. "But don't forget who you are." For an instant, something strange passed over Emily's face, but it was so quick that Ryan, distracted by other guests, didn't notice. If he had, he might have asked what Mrs. Chen meant by those words. The honeymoon was a succession of paradisiacal destinations, each more exclusive than the last. Ryan wanted to show Emily the world, to make up for all the years she had lived a simple life. To his surprise, she seemed happier in the most basic moments, walking barefoot on the beach, having breakfast on the hotel balcony, watching the sunset embraced by him. "I don't need luxury," she often said. "I just need you." It was during the last week of the trip, at a resort in the Maldives, that the first incident occurred that should have alerted Ryan. They were dining at the Main restaurant when a couple of Americans approached their table. "Emily?" "Emily Oliveira?" the woman asked, her face a mask of surprise. The glass Emily was holding trembled slightly, spilling a few drops of wine onto the white tablecloth. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice controlled. "I think you're confusing me with someone else. My name is Emily Montgomery now." The woman looked confused. "But I'm sure, didn't you work at—" "Excuse me," Emily interrupted, getting up abruptly. "I'm not feeling well. Ryan, can we go back to the room?" On the way back to the room, Ryan tried to ask about the incident, but Emily dismissed the subject with a story about an upset stomach caused by dinner. She took a long shower, and when she came out, her usual smile was back on her face. Back in the United States, the couple settled into the Montgomery mansion. Ryan observed with admiration how his wife adapted to the new life without losing her essence. While other women in her position would have plunged headfirst into the world of luxury and appearances, Emily maintained her characteristic simplicity. She transformed part of the garden into an organic vegetable patch, insisted on cooking some meals personally, dispensing with the services of the chef team, and continued to visit Cozy Corner Cafe regularly, now as a customer. The house staff adored her, enchanted by her kindness and simplicity. However, small details began to accumulate, like pieces of a puzzle that Ryan still couldn't put together. Emily never used social media. She always got tense when photographers appeared at social events. And more intriguingly, all her stories about the past seemed to start only a few years ago, as if her life before Cozy Corner Cafe didn't exist. One afternoon, while Emily was in the garden with her vegetable patch, Ryan found an old shoebox at the bottom of her closet. Inside, there was only a yellowed newspaper clipping and an old faded photo. Before he could examine it more closely, he heard her footsteps approaching, and in an impulse he couldn't explain, he put everything back in its place. That night, lying next to her in the king-size bed, Ryan observed his wife's profile illuminated by the moonlight coming through the window. Emily slept peacefully, her breathing soft and regular, completely oblivious to the thoughts that populated her husband's mind. Who really was the woman he had married? Why so much mystery surrounding her past? And why, despite all the doubts that were beginning to arise, couldn't he help but love her more and more? Ryan didn't know it, but he was about to discover that sometimes love is not enough to keep secrets buried forever, and that some truths, when they finally come to light, have the power to destroy even the most solid relationships. The business trip to New York City wasn't in Ryan's plans. The merger between Montgomery Enterprises and the Albuquerque Group was too important an opportunity to be conducted remotely. Even so, something bothered him about the idea of leaving Emily alone for the first time since the wedding. "It's just 3 days, love," she said, helping him pack. "I'll take the opportunity to reorganize some things in the house and maybe start that winter garden project I mentioned." Ryan watched her folding his shirts with precision, her movements delicate and precise. After 8 months of marriage, he still found himself admiring the small details that made him fall in love more and more. The way she bit her lip when she was concentrating, the way her eyes lit up when she talked about her garden projects. "You could come with me," he suggested, not for the first time. "New York is beautiful this time of year." Emily paused for a moment, her hands hesitating. "Over a silk tie." "Better not," she replied with a soft smile. "You need to focus on business. Besides, someone needs to keep an eye on the vegetable patch." The first day of meetings went as expected. The Albuquerque Group's office occupied an entire floor of a commercial building overlooking Central Park. Between discussions about assets and financial projections, Ryan barely had time to miss home. It was during dinner with Charles Albuquerque, president of the group, that the first shard of his perfect world began to form. The conversation flowed naturally, accompanied by an award-winning red wine when the name came up casually. "Montgomery," said Charles, pouring himself more wine. "That Precision Investments case still gives me chills. Did you follow it? Must have been about 5 years ago." Ryan shook his head negatively, more interested in his filet mignon than in old market stories. "A fascinating story," Charles continued, his eyes shining with the excitement of someone who loves to share good gossip. "An entire team of high-level con artists. They managed to embezzle millions before anyone noticed. The leader was an incredible woman from what they said. Intelligent, sophisticated. What was her name again?" He frowned, trying to remember. "Olivia, Emily, something like that." Ryan's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. "Emily?" "That's it. Emily Oliveira," Charles snapped his fingers. "A true specialist in creating false identities. They say she could completely transform herself, fool anyone. But the most interesting thing is that she simply disappeared. No one ever heard from her again." The rest of the dinner passed like a blur for Ryan. His mind was stuck on that name, Emily Oliveira, and on the memory of the incident in the Maldives when his wife was called exactly by that name. Back at the hotel, his hands trembled as he typed the words into the browser, Emily Oliveira Precision Investments. The results began to appear, each one like a stab in his chest. Old reports talked about a sophisticated fraud scheme. Black and white photos showed only shadows of people leaving a courthouse. In one of them, partially covered by a coat, a dark-haired woman looked too familiar. Ryan spent the night awake, alternating between moments of absolute denial and others of painful clarity. Small details began to make sense. Emily's resistance to taking photos, her insistence on keeping the wedding discreet, the total absence of friends or family from her past. The next morning, he cancelled the remaining meetings, citing a family emergency. Before catching the flight back to Chicago, he did one last search. The former headquarters of Precision Investments was just a few blocks from his hotel. The building now housed other companies, but the doorman, an elderly gentleman who had worked there for decades, still remembered that time. With a few $100 bills, his memories became even clearer. "Ah yes, the lady from the 12th floor," he said, his old eyes lost in memories. "Very elegant, very polite. Always greeted everyone by name. Had a special way with people, you. Made anyone feel important?" Ryan felt his stomach churn. That was exactly how Emily behaved with the staff at their house. Do you remember what she looked like?" The doorman scratched his chin. "Beautiful, very beautiful. Brown hair, honey-colored eyes, had a smile that lit up the room, but after all that scandal, I never saw her again." On the flight back to Chicago, Ryan felt as if he was living in a nightmare. Charles Albuquerque's words echoed in his mind. A true specialist in creating false identities. Could fool anyone. Could it be possible? Here's Emily, the woman who cultivated roses in the garden and insisted on preparing his breakfast personally. Could she be the same person who had orchestrated one of the biggest financial frauds in recent years? When the taxi stopped in front of the Montgomery mansion, it was already night. The house lights were on, and through the windows, Ryan could see Emily moving in the kitchen, probably preparing dinner as she did every night. For a moment, he stood in the garden, observing that domestic scene. She was wearing an apron over a simple dress, her hair casually tied back as she stirred something on the stove, the image of the perfect, devoted wife. But now, for the first time since he had met her, Ryan wondered if all of that wasn't just another masterful performance. Every smile, every gesture of affection, every moment of apparent simplicity, were they all part of an elaborate plan? "Ryan!" Her voice reached him as soon as he opened the door. "What a wonderful surprise! Why didn't you tell me you'd be back?" "Early?" Emily approached to kiss him but stopped halfway, noticing something in his expression. Did something happen? Ryan stared at her, searching her face for some sign of the woman described in the reports, some clue of the person who had destroyed lives and disappeared without a trace. But all he saw was his Emily, with her concerned eyes and hesitant smile. "We need to talk," he finally said, his voice firmer than his broken heart would have allowed. Emily's smile faltered, for an instant, so briefly that anyone else wouldn't have noticed. But Ryan was no longer just anyone. Now he was looking for the signs. "Of course, love," she replied, and her voice was as soft as always. "Let me just turn off the stove." As he watched her move around the kitchen, Ryan wondered if he was about to discover that his fairy tale had been just an elaborate illusion. And more importantly, if he was prepared for the truth, whatever it might be. The aroma of tomato sauce still lingered in the kitchen when Emily and Ryan sat face to face in the living room. Dinner, now forgotten on the stove, was slowly cooling, as was the air between them. The large windows of the mansion reflected their images like in a dark mirror, two people who suddenly seemed strangers to each other. "How was the trip to New York?" Emily asked, her voice controlled, but her fingers nervously playing with the hem of the apron she was still wearing. Ryan observed her for a long moment before answering. How had he not noticed the small signs before? The way she always diverted. The conversation when the subject was her past. How her eyes sometimes seemed distant, lost in memories she never shared. "Interesting," he finally answered. "I met fascinating people, including some who told me a very curious story about precision investments." The sound of Emily's breathing became audible in the silence of the room. Her hands stopped playing with the apron, and for a moment it was as if she had turned into a statue. "Charles Albuquerque is a man with an impressive memory," Ryan continued, his voice maintaining a calmness he didn't feel. He remembered perfectly. A certain Emily Oliveira. The name fell between them like a bomb. Emily closed her eyes for an instant, and when she opened them again, there was something different in them. The fear that had always been there, hidden in the depths, now overflowed. "Ryan, I can explain—" "Explain what exactly?" he interrupted her, rising from the armchair. "That my wife, the woman I married, is a completely different person than she pretended to be? That our whole story was based on lies?" "No." Emily also stood up, her hands extended in a gesture of supplication. "Our love is real. Everything I feel for you is true." "How can I believe that?" Ryan ran his hands through his hair in frustration. "How can I believe anything you say now?" Tears began to run down Emily's face, but there was a new expression in her eyes, a mixture of resignation and determination that Ryan had never seen before. "You want the truth?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "All of it?" Ryan nodded, silently bracing himself for what was to come. "Yes, I was Emily Oliveira," she began, sitting down again. "And yes, I worked at Precision Investments, but it wasn't like they think. I wasn't the mastermind behind everything. I was just a piece in a much bigger game." She paused, as if organizing her thoughts, or perhaps carefully choosing her next words. "I was young, ambitious, and naive. When they offered me the job, it seemed like a dream come true. The salary was excellent, the people were sophisticated, and I finally had the chance to be someone." Ryan watched every expression that crossed her face, trying to separate the truth from possible manipulations. At first, it was just a normal job at an investment company, but gradually they started asking me for special favors, Small alterations in documents, signatures that needed to be authenticated urgently. When I realized the true nature of what was happening, I was already too involved. "And you never thought about reporting it?" Ryan asked, his voice softer now but still laden with pain. Emily let out a bitter laugh. "Report it? To whom?" "The people involved were powerful, Ryan. They had connections everywhere. When I tried to distance myself, they made it very clear what would happen if I said anything." She stood up, walking to the window. The Chicago night sparkled outside, millions of lights resembling fallen stars. "So you ran," Ryan completed. "I had no choice. When everything came to light, I knew I would be used as a scapegoat. The real culprits had protected themselves well, leaving all the evidence pointing to me." Emily turned to face him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I changed my name, my appearance, my entire life. I spent years living in fear, moving from city to city until I arrived in Chicago. Cozy Corner Cafe was my salvation. Mrs. Chen gave me a chance without asking questions, and for the first time in a long time, I felt I could rebuild my life." "And then I appeared," Ryan said, his voice a mixture of understanding and hurt. "Yes," she whispered, "and for the first time since everything happened, I allowed myself to be truly happy. It wasn't an act, Ryan. Every moment with you, every smile, every 'I love you,' it was all real." The silence that followed was deafening. Ryan walked to the bar and poured himself a drink, needing something to calm his nerves. "Why didn't you tell me before?" he finally asked. "And risk losing you?" Emily shook her head. "I knew that if I told you the truth, you would see me differently, as you're seeing me now." "You didn't give me the chance to choose," he replied. "You didn't trust me enough to let me decide for myself." "You're right," she admitted, "but the fear never goes away completely. Even now, after so much time, I still look over my shoulder, still wonder when everything will fall apart." Ryan put the glass on the table with more force than necessary. "And now? What else are you hiding, Emily? Or is that not even your real name?" Her eyes widened at the question, and for a moment it seemed she was going to say something more. But before she could answer, the sound of the doorbell echoed through the house, making them both start. It was almost 10 o'clock at night. No one usually visited them at that hour. Emily visibly paled. "Ryan," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "did you tell anyone about what you discovered?" He frowned, confused by her reaction. "No, I just got back from New York." "Why?" The doorbell rang again, more insistent this time. "Because," Emily replied, her face a mask of terror, "I think the past has finally caught up with me." The doorbell rang for the third time, longer and more insistent. Emily grabbed Ryan's arm, her fingers trembling. "Don't open it," she whispered. "Please." Ryan looked at his wife, or whoever she really was, and saw genuine terror in her eyes. Despite all his anger and confusion, something inside him still wanted to protect her. "Mrs. Montgomery." The voice of the mansion's security guard came through the intercom. "There are two gentlemen here, saying they're from the old Precision Investments. They insist on speaking with you, ma'am." Emily's face lost all color. "How did they find me?" she murmured, more to herself than to Ryan. "Do you know these people?" Ryan asked, his voice tense. "We need to get out of here," she replied, ignoring the question. "Now." "Emily, enough running, enough secrets. We need to face this." She shook her head frantically. "You don't understand. These people, they're not what they seem. Precision wasn't just an investment company. It was much bigger, much more complex." The intercom rang again. "Mr. Montgomery, the visitors say it's an urgent matter. Should I let them in?" Ryan looked at Emily, who was now pacing back and forth in the living room like a caged animal. "Ryan," she said, her voice suddenly clear and firm, "if you still feel anything for me, I need you to trust me now. Just this once." He hesitated for a moment, then approached the intercom. "Paul, tell them we were just leaving. Ask them to come back during business hours." "Yes, sir." Emily let out a sigh of relief, but her posture remained tense. "We need to go to a safe place. I have an apartment. No, Ryan interrupted her. First, you're going to tell me everything. Absolutely everything. She nodded slowly. You're right, but not here. I know a place. 15 minutes later, they were in Ryan's car following less busy streets of Chicago. Emily guided him to a 24-hour cafe in the Lincoln Park neighborhood, a small and discreet establishment mainly frequented by university students. They chose a table in the back, away from the windows. The place was almost empty at that hour, just an elderly couple drinking tea at the counter and a student hunched over books in a corner. Precision Investments was just the tip of the iceberg, Emily began, her hands wrapping around a coffee, cup she wasn't drinking. Behind the facade of an investment company, there was a complex network of international financial operations. What kind of operations? The kind that involves very powerful and very dangerous people, she answered, lowering her voice even more. At first, I really believed I was working for a legitimate company. I was young, ambitious, wanted to prove my worth. They chose me carefully. They looked for people like that, easy to manipulate with promises of success and recognition. Ryan watched every expression that crossed her face, looking for signs of manipulation, but found only genuine pain and regret. I started as a financial assistant, but soon realized I had a natural talent for numbers and dealing with people. In less than a year, I was promoted to special accounts manager. That's when I started seeing strange things. What kind of things? Transfers that didn't make sense, companies that existed only on paper, clients who never appeared in person. When I started asking questions, they offered me a substantial raise and an even higher position. Emily paused, taking a sip of coffee, her hands still trembling slightly. And you accepted, Ryan completed. Yes, she admitted. I convinced myself that I was exaggerating, that in large corporations, it was normal to have some flexibility in operations. The salary was extraordinary, the power was seductive, until I found something I shouldn't have. What? Documents. Evidence that Precision was being used for money laundering operations on an international scale. It wasn't just a few million, as the press reported, it was billions, involving politicians, businessmen, people who appeared in newspapers as exemplary citizens. Ryan felt a shiver run down his spine. Why didn't you report it? Emily let out a bitter laugh. I tried. I gathered all the evidence I could and approached a journalist. 2 days later, he mysteriously disappeared from the country. On the same day, I received photos of myself in different places at different times. The message was clear. They were watching me. And that's when you ran. Not immediately. First, I tried to play their game. I pretended everything was fine, that I was part of the team. Meanwhile, I started saving information, creating an escape plan, but they were smarter. When the scheme finally came to light, they had prepared everything so that I would be the only one to blame. Ryan leaned back in his chair, processing all that information. And now, why would they be looking for you after so long? Emily's face grew even paler. Because I took something with me when I ran, something they desperately want back. What? She looked around nervously before answering. A flash drive, containing all the names, all the connections, all the evidence I managed to gather. It's my life insurance, you understand. As long as I have this information, they can't... Emily stopped abruptly. Through the cafe window, a black car had parked across the street. We need to go, she said, getting up quickly. They followed us. Ryan looked out the window and saw 2 men in suits getting out of the car. Even from a distance, there was something intimidating about their postures. There's an exit through the back, Emily whispered. Let's go. As they discreetly headed for the cafe's back exit, Ryan realized he was at a point of no return. His certainties about Emily had been completely shaken, but one thing was clear. The fear in her eyes was real, and whatever the complete truth was, she was in danger. The Chicago night swallowed them as they emerged into a narrow alley, the distant sound of the big city muffling their hurried steps. Emily held his hand tightly, guiding him through paths he had never noticed existed in his own city. "Where are we going?" he asked in a whisper. To the only place where I still have some control over this story, she replied, her eyes shining with fierce determination. It's time for you to meet the real Emily. The streets of downtown Chicago seemed like a labyrinth. In the darkness, Emily guided Ryan through narrow alleys and almost invisible passages, her knowledge of the area demonstrating years of meticulous planning. After several turns and detours to ensure they weren't being followed, they stopped in front of an old commercial building, its Art Deco facade revealing the glory of times past. The Rookery Building, Emily explained in a low voice, typing a code into a discreet panel next to a side door. People only see the historic facade, the offices on the main floors. Nobody pays attention to the details, the spaces between spaces. The door opened silently, revealing a narrow corridor. Emily took a small keychain from her pocket, the dim light revealing her still trembling hands. When I fled from Precision, she continued as they climbed a service staircase, I knew I would need a safe place, not just to hide, but to keep the evidence I had gathered. This building has stories within stories, Ryan. Not all spaces appear on the official plans. On the 12th floor, instead of following the main corridor, Emily opened a door that seemed to lead to a storage room. Inside, among old boxes and furniture covered by sheets, there was a door camouflaged in the wall. Welcome to my true home, she said, turning on the lights. Ryan blinked, surprised. The environment was completely different from what he expected. It was a small but meticulously organized space, with walls covered by newspaper clippings, photos, and documents connected by colored wires like a giant conspiracy map. I spent years building this place, Emily explained, moving through the space with familiarity. Each document, each photo, each connection, it's like a giant puzzle that never stops growing. Ryan approached one of the walls, observing the photos. He recognized several faces, important politicians, famous businessmen, figures from the high financial echelon, all connected by lines that converged to a central point, Precision Investments. The company was just a facade, Emily continued, sitting in front of an old laptop. The real business was power, information, control. They created such a complex network of favors and blackmail that no one could escape once they entered. And how did you manage? Emily smiled sadly. I didn't, not completely. I'm here, aren't I? Still running, still hiding, but at least I have this. She opened a disguised drawer in the desk and took out a silver flash drive. The whole truth is here, every transaction, every secret deal, every name involved. Ryan approached, looking at the small device with a mixture of fascination and apprehension. That's why they're still after you after so long. It's not just that, she replied, her voice trembling slightly. There's something bigger, something I discovered by accident, something that involves a project called Operation Phoenix. She typed quickly on the laptop, opening a series of files. Precision wasn't just laundering money. They were creating something, a parallel financial system, completely outside the control of any government or institution. The screens showed complex diagrams, codes, and spreadsheets that Ryan, even with all his business experience, could barely understand. Imagine, Emily continued, her eyes shining with an almost feverish intensity, a system that allows moving billions instantly, without leaving traces, without being accountable to anyone. A system that makes it possible to control entire economies without anyone noticing. And you have proof of this. I have more than proof. I have the source codes, the access keys, everything they need to make the system work. When I realized what was happening, I not only copied the information, I sabotaged the entire project. Ryan ran his hands over his face, trying to absorb the magnitude of what he was hearing. That's why you hid as a waitress. That's why you avoided photographs and social media. Yes, she nodded, but it wasn't just a matter of hiding. I needed a simple life, something completely opposite to what I was before. Cozy Corner Cafe. Mrs. Chen, that saved me, Ryan. It made me remember who I was before all this, before the ambition, before the power. She stood up, approaching him. And then you appeared. At first, I tried to resist. I knew that getting close to someone like you, so public, so exposed, was dangerous, but But you were different from everyone I met in that world. Honest, sincere, genuine. I fell in love not for your money or power, but for your humanity." Ryan felt his heart tighten. Despite all the anger and confusion, he could still see in her eyes the same sparkle that had enchanted him on the first day. "Why are you showing me all this now?" Emily took a deep breath. "Because we need to make a decision. They won't give up, Ryan. Now that they've found me, they won't stop until they get what they want. I have 3 options. Hand everything over and hope they leave me alone, which probably won't happen. Keep running, this time forever and far away, or expose everything. Use the evidence I have. Tell the complete story. But that would mean facing not just Precision, but all the powerful people involved. And it would put you at risk too." Before Ryan could respond, a familiar sound echoed through the room. The notification of a message on his cell phone. When he looked at the screen, his blood froze. It was a photo taken less than an hour ago of him and Emily entering the Rookery building. "They found us," Emily whispered, her face losing all color. "And now we have less time than I thought to decide what to do." Emily moved quickly through the small space, her fingers flying over the laptop keyboard as she initiated a sequence of commands. "Emergency protocol," she explained without taking her eyes off the screen. "I have backups of everything on secure servers, but we need to ensure nothing falls into the wrong hands." Ryan watched his wife with new eyes. The delicate woman who cultivated roses in the garden had disappeared, replaced by someone who moved with the precision of an experienced strategist. It was like watching a metamorphosis in real time. "How much time do we have?" he asked, trying to keep calm. "Minutes. Maybe," Emily replied, inserting a flash drive into a USB port. "But I have a plan. I've always had a plan." She opened a protected folder on the computer, revealing dozens of carefully organized documents. "You see this? These are years of investigation, not just about Precision, but about the entire network. Politicians, businessmen, judges, people who consider themselves untouchable. What exactly do you intend to do?" Emily finally stopped, turning to face him. "The truth, Ryan, is that I never planned to use this information to protect myself. It was tempting, of course. I could have negotiated my safety, made deals. But that would mean allowing them to continue, for other people to be manipulated as I was." She approached the wall of evidence, gently touching one of the photos. "For years, I collected every piece of information, every piece of evidence, every connection, not to hide, but to choose the right moment to expose everything. And that moment is now?" Ryan asked, beginning to understand. "Now they've forced me to act," she confirmed. "But I need you to understand something. Once this starts, there's no turning back. Our lives will never be the same." Ryan processed her words, looking around. The small secret office. Each document, each photo, each note represented years of meticulous work. Years in which Emily had lived a double life, carrying the weight of a secret that could change the course of countless lives. "Why didn't you tell me before?" he asked, his voice softer now. Emily smiled sadly. "Because I needed to protect you. And selfishly, I wanted to preserve what we had. Those moments in the garden, our conversations during breakfast, the simplicity of our life together. It was real, Ryan. More real than anything I've ever lived." The sound of footsteps in the corridor interrupted the moment. They were still distant, but unmistakable. "We don't have any more time," Emily said, returning to the computer. "I need to make a decision now, and I need you to understand the consequences." She opened one last file, revealing a detailed plan. "This is Operation Truth, a protocol I developed to expose everything at once. When activated, it will automatically send all the evidence to investigative journalists, prosecutors, and international agencies. There will be no way to cover it up, to hide it." "And what happens after?" "Chaos," she answered simply. "The financial system will tremble. Powerful people will fall. Fortunes built on lies will disappear." Ryan could hear the footsteps approaching. "Including mine?" Emily stared at him, her eyes full of unshed tears. "Your company is clean, Ryan. I verified every detail even before I allowed myself to get close to you. You're one of the few people in this environment who really built something honest." She extended her hand, hovering over the enter key. "But once this starts, we'll be targets. We'll have to disappear, start over from scratch. I'm asking you to abandon everything you've built your entire life for a cause that isn't even yours." Ryan looked at his wife. This woman he had known as a simple waitress and who now revealed herself as a warrior in a battle much bigger than he could have imagined. He thought about his life before her, the success, the power, the respect. And then he thought about the simple moments they had shared, the peace he had found by her side. The footsteps were now on the same floor. Low voices could be heard, people systematically searching each room. "Emily," he said, placing his hand over hers on the keyboard, "you once asked me why I fell in love with you. Remember?" She nodded, tears silently running down her face. "I said it was your authenticity, your ability to find beauty in the simplest things. Now I understand that was the truest part of you, not the waitress, not the financier, but the woman who never lost her humanity, even when facing something so much bigger than herself." The footsteps were getting closer and closer. "What are you saying?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ryan intertwined his fingers with hers over the keyboard. "I'm saying that some things are more important than money or power. I'm saying I want to be the man you always believed I was." Emily looked at their joined hands, then at the computer screen where the protocol awaited activation. "Together?" she asked, her voice finding renewed strength. "Together," he confirmed. The sound of a doorknob turning echoed through the external corridor. "Now," Ryan said. Emily pressed enter. On the screen, a progress bar began to advance. "Initiating Operation Truth. Data transmission in progress." The world began to change at the exact moment Emily pressed enter. As the progress bar advanced on the computer screen, dozens of emails were simultaneously sent to newsrooms, prosecutors' offices, and regulatory agencies around the globe. Years of carefully guarded secrets were now flowing through the internet, impossible to be stopped. 30 seconds until completion, Emily murmured, her eyes fixed on the screen. After that, there's no going back. Ryan could hear voices in the corridor getting closer and closer. His heart was racing, but curiously, he didn't feel afraid. For the first time in his life, he was absolutely certain he was doing the right thing. "I have one last trick," Emily said, quickly typing a series of commands. "An escape route I planned years ago, hoping I'd never need to use it." The screen showed 100% completion exactly when the first knock sounded on the door of the external storage room. "Mr. and Mrs. Montgomery," a formal male voice echoed. "We know you're in there. We need to talk." Emily smiled, a smile that mixed triumph and determination. "Too late," she whispered, pressing one last key. Instantly, the lights in the entire building went out. In the sudden darkness, Ryan felt Emily grab his hand. "Now," she said softly, "we need to be very quick and very quiet." With the familiarity of someone who knew every inch of the place, Emily guided them through the darkness to a part of the wall that, under her touch, revealed itself to be a camouflaged door. On the other side, there was a rarely used service staircase, a remnant of the rookery's original construction that didn't appear on any current floor plan. As they hurriedly descended the steps, they could hear the commotion above them. The power outage had caught their pursuers by surprise, creating precious minutes of advantage. "What happens now?" Ryan asked as they descended. "Now," Emily replied, her voice firm despite the effort, "the world will start to change. In the next few hours, journalists around the globe will be receiving and verifying thousands of documents. Connections will be established. Names will be revealed." They reached a level that seemed to be an old basement. Emily guided them through a narrow corridor, illuminated only by the weak light of emergency lamps. "But before that happens," she continued, "we need to disappear. They'll try to find us, try to prevent us from testifying when the investigations begin." The corridor led them to a service door that opened onto a side street, away from the building's main entrance. The Chicago night greeted them with its usual bustle, completely oblivious to the drama unfolding. I have a car prepared 2 blocks from here, Emily explained as they walked quickly, trying to look like a normal couple taking a night stroll. And a safe house where we can stay for the next few days until it's time to leave. Leave for where? Emily stopped for a moment, turning to face him. You still have a chance to turn back, Ryan. I may have exposed the truth, but you don't need to disappear with me. You can claim you didn't know anything, that you were deceived. Ryan interrupted her with a kiss, right there in the middle of the street. When they separated, his eyes were shining with determination. I'm exactly where I want to be, he said. Besides, someone needs to make sure you don't get addicted to adrenaline and go around taking down more criminal schemes. Emily laughed, a surprisingly light sound given the moment. I can't promise anything. It seems I have a natural talent for it. They reached the car, a common model that wouldn't draw attention in traffic. As Emily drove through the city streets, Ryan checked the news on his cell phone. It's already started, he said, showing her the screen at a traffic light. The first websites are publishing headlines about a massive leak of documents involving precision investments. It's going to get bigger soon, Emily replied, turning her attention back to the traffic. What I sent isn't just about precision. It's about the entire system, all the connections. It's going to hit banks, governments, companies in dozens of countries. They followed alternative routes, avoiding the main avenues. Emily had clearly memorized several routes, making random detours to ensure they weren't being followed. You know what's ironic, she commented after a few minutes of silence? I spent years building this double life, living in fear, preparing for this moment. And now that it's finally happened, I feel freer than ever. Ryan took her hand on the gear shift, squeezing it gently. Because you're not alone anymore. Emily smiled, a genuine smile that reminded him of the waitress he had fallen in love with. No, I'm not. And wherever we go now, we go together. The car continued through the night, leaving behind the lights of the big city. In the backseat, the laptop continued executing its final protocols, sending waves of truth through the internet that would soon turn into a tsunami of revelations. On the radio, an announcer interrupted the music for an extraordinary bulletin. Attention, dear listeners. We are receiving information about an unprecedented leak of financial documents. Authorities have not yet commented, but sources indicate that the case may be bigger than any other financial scandal in history. Emily turned up the volume slightly, a small smile playing on her lips. And so it begins, she murmured. Ryan nodded, watching the first lights of dawn begin to paint the horizon. A new day was dawning, and with it, a world different from the one they had known until then. A world where the truth, however difficult it might be, would finally come to light. Where exactly are we going? He asked after a few miles. First, Emily replied, to a place where we can safely watch events unfold. Then, well, I've always wanted to see Alaska. They say it's a great place to start over. Ryan smiled, leaning back in his seat. The adrenaline was starting to subside, replaced by a strange feeling of peace. He had lost his company, his fortune, his life as he knew it. But looking at the woman beside him, he realized he had gained something much more valuable, the truth and someone to share it with. The small inn in the mountains of upstate New York seemed to exist in a parallel reality, while the world out there was experiencing the biggest financial earthquake in its history. Emily and Ryan watched it all through an old television in the establishment's communal room. 3 more arrests were made this morning, announced the news anchor. The scandal that has become known as Precision Gate continues to reveal surprising connections between the financial market and prominent figures in international politics. Emily was sitting on the worn-out sofa, her legs crossed under her, a forgotten cup of tea in her hands. Her eyes didn't leave the screen, where a succession of familiar faces appeared. Executives being led by police, politicians making hasty statements, experts trying to explain the complexity of the scheme. It's surreal, she murmured. After keeping these secrets for so long, seeing them exposed like this. Ryan, who had been on the porch watching the sunrise over the mountains, came back inside and sat down beside her. Any regrets? No, she answered without hesitation. But it's strange. Part of me still can't believe it really happened. On the television, a reporter was standing in front of Precision Investments headquarters, now surrounded by police tape. Sources indicate that the leaked documents reveal a scheme of international proportions, involving more than 50 countries and hundreds of shell companies. The amount of information is so vast that authorities estimate the investigations could last years. Years, Emily repeated, shaking her head. And yet they'll probably never know everything. There were layers within layers, connections that even I couldn't fully map. Ryan picked up the remote control and lowered the TV volume. How are you? Really? Emily considered the question for a moment. A week had passed since the night they activated the protocol in the Rookery building. 7 days that seemed simultaneously an eternity and the blink of an eye. I feel light, she finally answered. It's as if I had been carrying an enormous weight for so long that I had forgotten what it was like to live without it. But I'm also worried. About you, mainly. Ryan took her hand, intertwining his fingers with hers. Why? Because you gave up everything. Your company, your reputation, your entire life. The company will survive, he gently interrupted. Richard is an excellent vice president, and the documents prove that Montgomery Enterprises was never involved in anything illegal. There will be investigations, of course, but in the end the company will recover. But you can't go back. No, he agreed. I can't. But you know something? Since all this started, I've been thinking a lot about what really matters in life. He stood up, pulling her with him to the porch. The valley below them was covered by a soft mist, and the first colors of the day painted the sky in shades of pink and gold. I spent years building an empire, he continued, focused on numbers, on growth, on being the best. And then you appeared, with your sincere smile and your ability to find joy in the simplest things, and made me question everything. Emily rested her head on his shoulder, watching a pair of hummingbirds vying for the garden flowers. Even when I discovered the truth, Ryan went on, even when I thought I had been deceived, I couldn't deny that those simple moments with you were the happiest of my life. And now I understand they weren't false moments. It was you, the real you, showing me a different way of living. On the television inside the inn, now almost mute, images showed demonstrations in various capitals around the world. People demanding investigations, reforms, changes in the financial system. Look at what you started, Ryan commented, nodding towards the TV. Emily sighed. Sometimes I wonder if I did the right thing. Not for the system or the powerful, but for ordinary people. The markets are in chaos. People are losing savings. It's like you said that night. Sometimes you need to cause an earthquake to rebuild something more solid. He hugged her from behind, both still observing the valley. The system was rotten from the inside. Sooner or later, something like this would happen. An inn employee appeared on the porch, bringing a tray with breakfast. He was an elderly gentleman who showed no interest in the news dominating the world, more concerned with his chickens and his vegetable garden. Our new passports arrived today, Emily said, softly after the old man had walked away. Are you sure you want to do this? Ryan picked up a piece of toast from the tray, watching the golden honey drip over it. Absolutely sure. Besides, I've always wanted to learn how to fish. Emily laughed, a sound that echoed through the valley. You'll need more than that to survive in Alaska. Well, I have an excellent teacher in adaptation and survival, he replied with a smile. On the TV, a new headline appeared. Precision Papers Complete. 1 week. Analysts compare impact to a revolution in the global financial system. Emily observed the news with a thoughtful expression. You know what's funny? When I entered Precision, I was looking for power, success, recognition. I spent years accumulating information, building my protection, and in the end, the greatest liberation came from giving up all of that. Ryan nodded, understanding perfectly what she meant. He too had spent years accumulating power and wealth, convinced that would make him happy. Sometimes, he said, you need to lose everything to find what really matters. A gentle breeze blew through the valley, bringing the aroma of wildflowers and wet earth. In the inn's small vegetable garden, the elderly gentleman hummed as he harvested vegetables for lunch, oblivious to the fact that he was hosting those responsible for the greatest financial revolution in modern history. "So," Emily said, after a moment of contemplative silence, "ready for our next adventure?" Ryan smiled, gently kissing her forehead. "With you? Always." And there, on that simple porch, watching the sun rise over the mountains, both felt a deep certainty. No matter what the future held, they had made the right choice. Because sometimes the true treasure isn't in what we accumulate, but in what we have the courage to leave behind. 2 years later, the cold Alaskan wind blew through the small cafe in the mountains, bringing with it the scent of snow and pine trees. The establishment, a rustic wooden construction overlooking the Denali National Park, had become a beloved meeting point for local residents and occasional travelers. Emily adjusted the small vase of wildflowers on the wooden counter as she watched the first customers of the day arrive. Her Spanish had improved considerably, but she still carried a slight accent that only seemed to increase her charm in the eyes of the patrons. "More coffee, my love?" she asked Ryan, who was absorbed in his laptop at one of the tables by the window. He looked up and smiled, that same smile that had won her over years ago at Cozy Corner Cafe. "Please. Your barista skills have only improved with time." The Denali Cafe, as they had decided to call the establishment, was different in almost every way from the busy corporate world they had left behind. There were no board meetings, financial reports, or million-dollar negotiations. Instead, their days were filled with conversations with interesting visitors, the aroma of freshly baked bread, and the peace that only the mountains can offer. Emily served a new cup of coffee to Ryan and sat across from him, observing the laptop screen where he was reading the latest news from the United States. "Has anyone else been indicted?" she asked, although her voice no longer carried the tension of before when the subject came up. "The last of Precision's directors," Ryan confirmed. "The investigations are finally coming to an end. The global financial system was never the same after the revelations, but it seems it has finally found a new balance." Emily nodded, her gaze lost in the majestic landscape beyond the window. The snow-covered mountains seemed eternal and unchanging, a constant reminder that some things in the world are beyond human manipulations. "I still dream about that night sometimes," she admitted softly. "The Rookery building, the escape, the fear, it seems like another life." "In many ways it was another life," Ryan replied, closing the laptop. "For both of us." A group of hikers entered the cafe, bringing with them the morning chill and cheerful laughter. Emily stood up to serve them, moving with the same grace that had caught Ryan's attention in that first encounter in Chicago. As he watched her work, Ryan reflected on how their lives had changed. The fortune he had managed to preserve, transferred to secure accounts before the revelations, had been more than enough to start their new life. But the real treasure, he had discovered, was in simple moments like this. Mrs. Johnson, a local lady who had practically adopted the couple since their arrival, entered the cafe bringing a basket of fresh herbs from her garden. "Emily, dear," she called in her melodious voice, "I brought that tea you asked for, and don't forget you promised to come have dinner with us tonight." Emily hugged her affectionately. "Of course we haven't forgotten, Mrs. Johnson. I even made that chocolate cake your grandson likes so much." Ryan observed the interaction with a smile. It was impressive how Emily had the gift of creating true bonds wherever she was. Her ability to connect with people, to make them feel special, wasn't a skill learned at Precision. It was simply who she was. Later that day, after the cafe closed, the couple decided to take a walk on the trail that led to a nearby viewpoint. The afternoon sun painted the mountains with golden hues, and the cold mountain air made each breath more conscious, more present. "I received an email from Mrs. Chen today," Emily commented as they climbed. "Cozy Corner Cafe is doing very well. She sent photos of the renovation she did." "Do you miss it?" Emily considered the question for a moment. "I miss the people, Mrs. Chen, the regular customers, but I don't miss the constant fear, the feeling of living a lie." They reached the viewpoint, where a rustic wooden bench offered the perfect view of the valley. They sat together, as they had done so many times over the past 2 years. "You know what's funny?" Ryan said, hugging her against the cold. "When you told me the whole truth that night, I thought I was losing everything. My company, my position, the life I had built. But in reality, I was just beginning to find what really matters." Emily smiled, that sincere smile that had survived all the masks and disguises. "I think we both needed to get lost to find ourselves." An eagle soared majestically over the valley, its enormous wings taking advantage of the air currents with a freedom that seemed an appropriate symbol for their own lives now. "The newspapers still talk about the mystery of who leaked the precision documents," Ryan commented. "There are conspiracy theories, speculations. No one imagines that those responsible are running a cafe in the mountains. And it's better that it stays that way," Emily replied with a mischievous smile. "Although sometimes when I see a customer very absorbed in their laptop, I wonder if it's not another one trying to unravel the mystery." They laughed together, a sound that echoed through the mountains. The sun was beginning to set, tinting the sky pink and orange, creating a spectacle that no fortune could buy. "I never imagined I would find so much peace after so much turbulence," Emily reflected. "It's as if all that chaos was necessary to bring us here." Ryan kissed her forehead softly. "Sometimes, the universe has a strange way of putting us exactly where we need to be." They began to descend the trail back to the cafe, where they needed to prepare for dinner with Mrs. Johnson. The life they had built here was simple, but deeply satisfying. Each day brought small joys, the smile of a satisfied customer, an interesting conversation with a traveler, the aroma of freshly ground coffee, the sunset over the mountains. "Emily," Ryan said when they were almost back, "do you regret anything?" She stopped, turning to face him. Her honey-colored eyes, the same ones that had enchanted him in that first encounter, shone with the light of the twilight. "Only not trusting you sooner," she replied. "But I think we needed to go through all of that to get here. Sometimes the longest path is the only one that leads us to the right place." Ryan pulled her in for a kiss, right there on the mountain trail. In the background, the lights of the small cafe began to shine, a welcoming beacon in the approaching night. "Shall we?" she asked when they separated. "Mrs. Johnson must be waiting." "Let's go," he replied, taking her hand. And so, they walked together towards the lights of the cafe, their new life, their true treasure. Because in the end, they discovered that the greatest wealth wasn't in the numbers of a bank account or in power over others, but in the courage to be authentic and the ability to find joy in the simplest things. The precision mystery would continue to intrigue the world for many years, but for Emily and Ryan, it had become just a chapter in a much larger story. The story of how two people found truth in each other, even when everything around them was built on lies. Dear listeners, we hope that Emily and Ryan's journey has touched your hearts. To continue exploring equally engaging stories about love, redemption, and courage, be sure to subscribe to our channel. We have a special playlist prepared with narratives that will make you reflect on the true meaning of wealth and happiness. Leave your like, share your impressions in the comments, and tell us which city you're following from. And remember, sometimes life's greatest treasures are hidden in the simplest places,